Sometimes escalation doesn't announce itself with explosions or ultimatums. Sometimes it arrives as a sentence that sounds technical, almost routine, said at a moment when everyone pretends nothing unusual is happening. A claim is made, a distance is mentioned, a speed is named. And suddenly the silence around it feels heavier than the words themselves. Over the past days, something has shifted in the tone of the region, though very few have named it directly. Warships move closer, not dramatically, not hastily, but with the calm precision of a system doing what it was designed to do. Statements are issued that sound less like threats and more like procedures. Negotiations are spoken of in the past tense, as if they were already exhausted, even before they formally collapse. What makes this moment uncomfortable is not the language of confrontation, but the absence of it. No shouting, no emergency declarations, just a steady narrowing of distance. Political signals stripped of emotion. Military hardware described with clinical confidence. And behind it all, a message that seems aimed not at an enemy, but at physics itself. At the center of this unease is not a fleet and not a leader, but an idea. The idea that speed can erase defense, that maneuverability can outpace prediction, that a moving object protected by layers of doctrine and technology can suddenly become fragile if the math no longer works in its favor. It sounds abstract, almost academic, until you realize how often entire strategies collapse when one assumption quietly fails. The claim itself is presented as capability, not intent. A missile that does not fly like the others. A trajectory that refuses to behave. A window of reaction compressed from minutes into seconds. Not a promise of attack, but a reminder that the old calculations may no longer apply. And that reminder is being broadcast precisely as the distance between potential targets closes. This is where the discomfort begins to build, because the real question is not whether such a weapon works exactly as described. The question is why this claim is being made now, why it is being repeated with such confidence, why it is framed not as deterrence, but as inevitability, and why the response so far has been movement rather than words. There is a long history of exaggerated capabilities in moments of tension. There is also a long history of systems that failed because they dismissed those claims too easily. Somewhere between propaganda and reality lies a narrow corridor where miscalculation thrives, and that corridor is usually invisible until it's already too late to step back. At this point, nothing has happened. No missiles launched, no defenses tested, no red lines crossed in public, but the structure of the situation has changed. The variables are no longer theoretical. The distances are no longer symbolic. And the confidence on both sides feels less like reassurance and more like momentum. It still looks manageable. It still looks contained. But this is usually the stage where everyone involved insists they are in control, right before the system begins to behave in ways no one fully planned for. The problem begins when you stop looking at the situation as a confrontation and start looking at it as a process. Not a clash of wills, but a chain of mechanisms interacting under pressure. At that level, intent matters less than structure, and confidence matters less than timing. What is being tested here is not a single weapon system, but an entire sequence of assumptions that modern naval power relies on. Detection leads to tracking. Tracking leads to prediction. Prediction leads to interception. Each step depends on the previous one behaving within known limits. Hypersonic systems are unsettling precisely because they attempt to blur those limits, not by becoming invisible, but by becoming unpredictable. Speed alone is not the disruption. Speed has been managed before. The real stress point lies in maneuvering at extreme velocity, in forcing defensive systems to recalculate continuously while time collapses. Algorithms that were designed to anticipate a future position seconds ahead suddenly find themselves chasing a moving uncertainty. And when reaction time is reduced far enough, even the most advanced systems begin to rely on probabilities rather than guarantees. But this is where the story becomes less dramatic and more uncomfortable. Because for all the focus on the missile itself, the missile is only the final link in a much longer chain. Sensors must see, satellites must track, command systems must fuse data fast enough to matter. Without that architecture, extreme speed turns into something very different. Not a precision instrument, but a blunt one. Hitting a fixed target is one thing. Hitting a moving target that actively avoids prediction is another. An aircraft carrier does not sit where it was minutes ago. It alters course, speed, formation. It exists inside a constantly shifting envelope of escorts, electronic warfare, deception, and layered defense. Against that, even the most advanced projectile becomes dependent on information that must be updated in near real time. This is where the system strains, not because one side lacks technology, but because the entire concept of hypersonic effectiveness against naval targets assumes a level of situational awareness that is extraordinarily difficult to sustain under combat conditions. The missile must know not where the target was, but where it will be, and that knowledge cannot be guessed. It has to be fed, corrected, verified, and protected from disruption. Electronic warfare enters quietly here, not as a dramatic shield, but as interference. Guidance systems that rely on sensors can be confused. Data links can be degraded. Small errors introduced at extreme speed become massive deviations over distance. A weapon that depends on precision becomes fragile when its eyes and ears are compromised, even briefly. This shifts the balance in a way that rarely makes headlines. The question stops being whether a single missile can penetrate defenses and becomes whether an entire system can function coherently under saturation, jamming, deception, and time pressure. In that environment, success is no longer about brilliance. It's about resilience, which leads to a colder conclusion that nobody likes to say out loud. If an attack were to occur, it would almost certainly not be elegant. It would not be a single decisive strike. It would be messy, layered, overwhelming by volume rather than perfection. Dozens of launches, multiple vectors, a deliberate attempt to overload cognition as much as hardware. And that is where the real danger sits, not in the promise of a miracle weapon, but in the logic that follows from its limitations. When precision is uncertain, systems compensate with quantity. When certainty disappears, escalation becomes procedural rather than emotional. And once that logic takes hold, stepping back becomes far more difficult than stepping forward. At this stage, nothing has failed yet. The mechanisms are still intact, the defenses are still layered, the claims are still claims. But the structure of interaction has shifted from signaling to stress testing. And systems under stress have a way of revealing weaknesses no one intended to expose. Once a system enters this phase, the consequences stop being theoretical. They stop living in specifications and diagrams and begin to shape behavior in real time. The question is no longer what can be done, but what must now be assumed. Carrier groups adjust patterns. Airspace management tightens. Electronic warfare moves from contingency to routine posture. Command decisions shorten their time horizons. When reaction windows compress, authority tends to move downward and forward, closer to the moment of contact. That shift alone changes the risk profile because it replaces deliberation with protocol. What matters most here is not whether a hypersonic strike would succeed, but what its possibility forces both sides to do in advance. Defensive layers are designed to absorb uncertainty, but they are not infinite. Each added measure carries cost, cognitive load, and opportunity trade-offs. When protection becomes the priority, projection quietly becomes secondary. At the same time, the side making the threat faces a different kind of pressure. Production capacity becomes strategic rather than symbolic. Targeting intelligence becomes the real bottleneck. Without continuous, protected data flow, even the fastest system degrades into approximation. An approximation, in high-stakes environments, invites escalation rather than resolution. This is where the point of no return begins to emerge, not as a single decision, but as a narrowing set of options. Once both sides plan around worst-case assumptions, restraint starts to look like vulnerability. Movement is interpreted as preparation. Silence is interpreted as concealment. Every delay becomes suspicious. Every exercise becomes rehearsal. The most unsettling aspect is how little of this requires intent. No one has to want to strike for the system to drift toward one. All it takes is the mutual belief that the other side might act, combined with mechanisms that reward speed over certainty. At that point, accidents stop being external risks and become internal features. There is also a quieter consequence that rarely enters public discussion. The normalization of these dynamics does not stay confined to one region. Doctrines adapt, budgets shift, Other actors watch and learn which behaviors extract concessions without crossing formal thresholds. The threshold itself begins to erode. What remains unresolved is not who would win such an exchange, but what winning would even mean afterward. A defended carrier surviving an attack still represents escalation. A missed strike still invites retaliation. Success and failure blur into continuation rather than conclusion. And this is the uncomfortable ending point. Not a climax, not a resolution, but a condition. A situation where the absence of action is no longer proof of stability, only a pause inside a system that has learned to operate under permanent strain. When everything is prepared, calibrated, and justified, the only unpredictable element left is timing. Another layer that rarely gets discussed openly is how this kind of standoff reshapes military logic far beyond the immediate players. Hypersonic systems were never meant to function in isolation. They are part of a broader transition away from deterrence based on certainty and toward deterrence based on disruption. The message is not, "We can destroy you," but "We can make your response unreliable." That distinction matters more than it sounds. Traditional deterrence relies on clear thresholds. You cross a line, you trigger a response. But systems built around speed, ambiguity, and compressed decision cycles deliberately blur those lines. They create environments where commanders are forced to act on partial information, where waiting can be interpreted as weakness, and where acting too early can trigger exactly the escalation everyone claims to want to avoid. There is also a strategic asymmetry at work that complicates any clean assessment. A carrier strike group represents concentrated power, but also concentrated risk. Its value is not only military, but symbolic. Threatening it is a way to challenge credibility rather than capability. Even an unsuccessful attack can achieve strategic effects if it forces changes in deployment, posture, or political calculation. At the same time, missile-centric strategies carry their own fragility. They depend on sustained industrial output, secure logistics, and protected command networks. Under prolonged pressure, those systems face attrition not just from interception, but from disruption, sabotage, and economic constraint. What looks formidable in a single exchange becomes far more uncertain over time. This is why the conversation quietly shifts away from weapons and toward endurance. How long can a system operate under constant alert without degrading? How many false alarms can decision makers absorb before judgment slips? How much uncertainty can be tolerated before someone decides that acting first is safer than waiting? History suggests that prolonged high-tension equilibria rarely end cleanly. They either de-escalate through political intervention, or they break through misalignment between expectation and reality. Often it is not the most dramatic moment that triggers the break, but the most routine one: a radar anomaly, a delayed transmission, a misunderstood maneuver. What makes the current situation particularly unstable is that it combines emerging technology with old geopolitical fault lines. New systems are being layered onto doctrines that were never designed for this level of speed and ambiguity. The result is not immediate chaos, but accumulated friction. And friction, once it reaches a certain point, does not need intent to produce outcomes. It only needs motion.